In 1926, the last gray wolf of Yellowstone was killed. No one knew at the time, but at this moment, this single event had devastating consequences for the entire ecosystem. Over the next few decades, the absence of wolves would allow elk populations to skyrocket, fundamentally changing the ecosystem and the landscape. Without the wolves, the balance of life in Yellowstone began to collapse. That is why today I'm here to tell you why reintroducing keystone species like wolves in Yellowstone will help restore ecological balance and biodiversity through the cascading effects they have on ecosystems. Now, what exactly is a keystone species? It's one that has a disproportionately large effect on its ecosystem versus its abundance. So in other words, it's a small species number in an ecosystem that has a great effect on everything else. The role of the keystone species in an ecosystem is heavily researched. One example would be Ripple and Dashta. In 2012, they published a study on the wolves in Yellowstone, which stated that they initiated a trophic cascade by reducing elk populations. Another example would be Estes et al. They focused on the global implications of keystone species. They wanted to show that it's not only in certain ecosystems that keystone species play a huge role. And it's also important to note that there are some uncertainties. While the role of wolves is heavily researched, there are other factors like climate change and human activity that can complicate our understanding of ecosystem dynamics post-reintroduction. Now, for the scope of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the wolves in Yellowstone, mostly because of time constraints, and it's also a great example of the importance of a keystone species. So after wolves were eradicated from Yellowstone, the elk population exploded. As you can see in this diagram, it took a few decades due to a buffer and a delay in the time period of the effects we saw with the wolves leaving, but the population skyrocketed from nearly 4,000 all the way up to 20,000. This led to an overgrazing of especially willows and aspens, which are a critical habitat and resource for songbirds and beavers, as well as multiple other animals. This resulted in a drastic change of the landscape that had an effect on the entire food web. Now, to show exactly what happened, this is a flow chart that shows how elk overgrazing led to less aspens and willows. These were critical for beavers. They used them for their dams, and because that resource was gone, the beavers left the area. This meant that there were fewer beaver dams, which accumulate water, creating wetlands and ponds. And wetlands and ponds are incredibly biodiverse habitats that host a number of species. So with those habitats gone, we saw songbirds vanish, streams erode, fish populations declined, and among multiple other effects. Then the US government in 1995 decided to reintroduce 31 gray wolves under the Endangered Species Act because they realized how much of an effect their eradication had on the environment. As soon as they started to hunt elk, we started to notice changes. The elk numbers decreased and they started avoiding areas with high predation like stream banks. Now this triggered a trophic cascade, which is when one species at the top of the food chain affects everything below it. This led to fewer elk because they were being hunted by the wolves. The willows and aspens recovered. Beavers returned to the areas. They created new dams, which allowed for wetlands and ponds to be restored. The population of birds, fish, and amphibians increased. Now, to give you a visual representation of what exactly is happening, this first diagram is going to show you the elk and wolf populations. So when the wolves were first introduced, their population skyrocketed because there was no competition for food. There were so many elk, they were able to reproduce pretty rapidly. Their population had an overshoot, and as the elks began to die down, their population stabilized as well. This is an example of a pond created by a beaver dam, and that's where all those species are using, especially migratory birds, are using that for a stopover point during their migration. This is a before and after photo. The before looks greener, but that's because it's all primary grasses that can grow pretty quickly, and then if you see later, there's longer term bushes, shrubs, and our evergreens are recovering. And it's important to note that this isn't, and we're not at an end date. When you repopulate a species, it takes a really long time to fully see the lasting effects, and we're still seeing effects now because it's only been 30 years. Now, not everyone agrees about the role the wolves played in the recovery of Yellowstone, and some argue that climate change and reduced human intervention was the major cause for this change, and while there is some validity to that, you can't attribute one factor to a whole change in the ecosystem towards the recovery, but the data heavily suggests that the wolves were the catalyst for this change. Now, this isn't a unique situation. The repopulation or reintroduction of keystone species has proven to be one of the most effective ways to restore an ecosystem. Sea otters were reintroduced to kelp forests. They began to feed on the parasitic sea urchins, and the kelp forests were restored. Multiple species returned to the areas. In the Serengeti, wildebeest were reintroduced to the area. They regulated vegetation through their grazing patterns. In the African savanna, elephants were reintroduced, and through their tree uprooting, they opened up grasslands. Now, this is more than just a conservation effort for one species. These reintroductions combat biodiversity loss, restore ecosystems, and can even mitigate climate change by helping natural ecosystems and habitats absorb carbon. In conclusion, the reintroduction of keystone species like wolves in Yellowstone is a powerful reminder that ecosystems are interconnected. By bringing back wolves, they not only saved a species, but an entire ecosystem. As we face global challenges of habitat destruction and climate change, we must continue to prioritize the protection and reintroduction of keystone species. Their presence can literally change the world around them. Thank you.
Thank you.